Good morning. Thank you for joining us. Week 46, day 3. We're in session 17 of this incredible storied world of the Bible. As we dive into the next session and we bring this series to a close, let's be inspired to understand the story we find ourselves in. I'm going to say the Jesus Creed out loud together, and then we'll dive into session 17. Will you join me as we pray? Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. And the second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There are no commands greater than these. Enjoy session 17 together.
It's because of all this that I, Paul, the prisoner of King Jesus on behalf of you Gentiles, I'm assuming, by the way, that you've heard about the plan of God's grace that was given to me to pass on to you. You know, the secret purpose that God revealed to me, as I wrote briefly just now. Anyway, when you read this, you'll be able to understand the special insight I have into the King's secret. This wasn't made known to human beings in previous generations, but now it's been revealed by the Spirit to God's holy apostles and prophets. The secret is this: that through the gospel, the Gentiles are to share Israel's inheritance. They are to become fellow members of the body along with them and fellow sharers of the promise in King Jesus. This is the gospel that I was appointed to serve, in line with the free gift of God's grace that was given to me. It was backed up with the power through which God accomplishes his work. I am the very least of all God's people. However, he gave me this task as a gift, that I should be the one to tell the Gentiles the good news of the King's wealth no one could begin to count. My job is to make clear to everyone just what the secret plan is, the purpose that's been hidden from the very beginning of the world in God who created all things. This is it, that God's wisdom in all its rich variety was to be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly places through the church. This was God's eternal purpose, and he's accomplished it in King Jesus our Lord. We have confidence and access to God in him in full assurance through his faithfulness. So I beg you, don't lose heart because of my sufferings on your behalf. That's your glory. When we come to the letters of Paul, with the great story that we've seen in the Old Testament and in the Gospels in our heads, we can't fail to notice, or one would think so, that Paul himself is picking up that story, celebrating it, and re-inhabiting it in all sorts of fresh ways. I say we can't help notice, but actually, of course, a lot of readers of Paul have not seen him as a storyteller at all, but have seen him as a dogmatician, putting out ideas which fit together in some kind of non-storied theme. But actually, once we realize how the story works, we are bound to see that Paul is full of it. In the letter to the Ephesians, the opening prayer, Ephesians 1, verses 3 to 14, it's a prayer, it's a liturgy if you like, but it's retelling the story of creation, the story of Exodus, the story of the Messiah, the story through which God has done a new thing, opening up the inheritance not just to Israel, but to all the nations. And we have received this, and he says, you too, you Gentiles, you have been marked out with the Spirit, who is the guarantee of our inheritance, until God's special possession, his special people, are finally reclaimed and freed. And this is for the praise of his glory. And if we have ears to hear, we can pick up the new Exodus themes, we can pick up the idea from Exodus 19 of Israel as God's special possession, and way back behind that again, the echoes of Genesis 1 and 2, and of the true humanity reflecting God into the world and the world back to God. So it's no surprise that in Ephesians chapter 2, Paul sees the church as the new temple, the temple in which Jew and Gentile come together. And exactly as in the narrative of the Old Testament, this new reality causes the powers of the world to stop and stare in amazement. Ephesians chapter 3, verse 10. Through the church, the manifold wisdom of God, God's wisdom in all its rich variety, was to be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly places. Just as in the fourth servant song, kings will shut their mouths when they see what God is doing and indeed who God is. So Ephesians is rooted in the great scriptural narrative. And again in Paul's other letters, we can see the same point. One of the most obvious passages would be 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Paul is addressing a church which has probably got a bit larger than was helpful, because we're told in the book of Acts that when Paul was preaching in Corinth, a great many people got baptized and came into the church, all in a rush. And they seem to have been regarding this Christianity business as simply a new way of being religious, a new kind of hobby that they would have, that they would take on. And Paul realizes, as he looks at that community, that many of them are in fact very zealous, very well-tuned believers, but that many are careless and don't realize that if you're going to be part of this community, there is a standard, there is a pattern of behavior. And so in 1 Corinthians 10, he tells them the story of the Exodus again. And he says, I want you to remember, I don't want you to be ignorant of the fact that our fathers were all under the cloud and all went through the sea and were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and the sea. Very interesting the way he puts that. Our fathers, for a start, well, it was Israel's patriarchs, but he's addressing a congregation now of Gentiles as well as Jews, and it's a congregation that must regard the patriarchs of Israel as their own ancestors. They have come into the family. And he talks about the Exodus events in terms of baptism and in terms of spiritual feeding. And just like the Israelites in the wilderness came through the Red Sea and then were given the manna and the water from the rock, so he says, you in your spiritual food and drink, and he's going to talk about the bread and the wine of the Last Supper, of the Eucharist, that this is now common property for the church. But, he says, the people who came out from Egypt, with many of them God was not pleased, because they thought they could just drift along and they were going to have a good time. And then they were grumbling in the wilderness, they were committing idolatry, they were doing all the things that go with committing idolatry. And so many of them, indeed, almost all of them, didn't actually make it to the promised land. And so Paul uses the Exodus story in order to say, you are the new Exodus people. But if you're the new Exodus people, then you have a vocation to which you must be obedient. So Paul can use the creation story, he can use the Exodus story, he can use the temple image, which he does to very good effect in 1 Corinthians as well, in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and chapter 6. Chapter 3, the whole church is the new temple, and in chapter 6, every individual Christian is a new temple because the Holy Spirit has come to dwell within the Christian, within the believer, so that Paul is not just using this as a vague example or as a metaphor for something. He's saying, no, this is the new reality. The God who came to dwell in the tabernacle in the wilderness, in Solomon's temple, he is the God who now dwells in you individually and corporately. But perhaps the places where the story of the Old Testament comes to full flower in Paul is in two letters, namely Galatians and Romans. I've spoken at length about them elsewhere in other courses, but I simply here summarize the way that the narrative works. In Galatians chapters 3 and 4, Paul is telling the story of Abraham. And he's doing this because some of the false teachers who had come into the church in Galatia had been saying that if these Gentile Christians wanted to be true members of the family of Abraham, they would have to get circumcised and obey the law of Moses. And so Paul tells the story from Abraham to the Messiah, very carefully spelling it out, Abraham, Moses, and then finally the Messiah when the time had fully come, in order to say that the promises to Abraham always envisaged a worldwide family, a worldwide inheritance, and that is what has now been fulfilled in the Messiah. Paul is here tracking with passages like Psalm 2, where the Abrahamic inheritance of the land is widened to include the whole world, to include all nations. And then he says, but if Moses was allowed to disrupt this, that would mean that the law would restrict the family just to a single nation, just to a single people. So he says, well, you need to understand how it works. the narrative arc that matters is the one that runs from Abraham to the Messiah. And the Mosaic dispensation, the Torah, the giving of the law, was necessary precisely because ever since Abraham, the people of God were a two-storied people. They weren't simply a smoothly progressing people taking the promises of God forward to their conclusion. They were also a rebel people, going every way they could but the way God wanted them to go. And so the Mosaic law, he says, was necessary because of transgressions. It was necessary for a time. It was there to keep Israel from going utterly to the bad until the time when the Messiah came. And so in Galatians 4, he tells a miniature version of the Exodus story. We were slaves. When the time came, God sent forth his Son, and now you are no longer slaves, but sons. Israel is my son, my firstborn, says Moses to Pharaoh in God's name. And therefore, if you're sons, you are heirs. You are the ones who share the inheritance. From slavery through rescue to sonship to being the ones who inherit the promise. This is the Exodus narrative. And Paul is saying it's all come true in Jesus and by the Spirit. And with the Spirit, we hear again those temple overtones, that the Spirit comes to dwell in God's people, so that the glorious presence of God will be not simply something that happens in a building or in a tent somewhere, but actually something that happens where God's people gather to worship, and in every single believer, man, woman, and child. And then in Romans, the great narrative unfolds itself. Because Paul tells in Romans 1-4 the story of the human race, there are echoes of Genesis 3 in Romans chapter 1 when he's talking about humans worshipping and serving the creature rather than the creator. And when Paul explains how God has dealt with that in chapters 2 and 3, he then opens it up in chapter 4 with the story of Abraham, as though to say, so now this is how God has been true to the promises he made to Abraham in Genesis chapter 15. God promised Abraham this vast, uncountable family, and Abraham believed that promise, and it was on that basis that God established his covenant with him. And the promise always envisaged a worldwide family. But, says Paul, if it was to be a worldwide family, then obviously Paul was realizing that God had promised that Gentiles would come into that family as well. And so Abraham believed that God would justify the ungodly and would do so by faith. And so the inheritance, Paul says, Romans 4:13, was never simply that one land. It was the whole world. The promise to Abraham and his descendants was that they would inherit the world. And that has now in principle been accomplished in Jesus. So then he stands back from the whole sequence, and in Romans 5:12-21, he tells the story of Adam and the Messiah, the story which runs from the original promise, the original creation, the disobedience of Adam, and now the obedience of the Messiah. Paul is stepping back and saying, if we want to understand the story, we have to see it as the story of creation and new creation. And the line that then runs on into Romans 8 is precisely that. Astonishingly, many expositors and readers of Romans have been puzzled about Romans 8, verses 18-27, because all this stuff about creation groaning in travail and creation eventually being set free from its slavery to decay, that doesn't fit with many Western Christian ideas, according to which the gospel is about my soul being rescued from this sinful body and world in order to go to heaven. That's not what Paul's talking about at all. He is completely in line with the Old Testament story, so that Romans 6, 7, and 8 together form a large-scale Exodus narrative. In Romans 6, we come through the waters of baptism, which once again, as in the Gospels, are resonating with the story of the Exodus, the crossing of the Red Sea. This is the moment, Romans 6, when the slaves become free. But once the slaves have become free, they come in the story to Mount Sinai, where the law is given. And Romans 7 is all about the effect of the giving of the law. and the result of that in terms of the covenant failure of Israel, that Israel is the people of this double-sided story. That is precisely what's going on in Romans. The story of God's promises and purposes, and of a good law, which really is God's law, but of Israel as a rebellious people, grinding badly against that law and finding themselves in rebellion against it. So Paul says, "Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me?" This is the cry of Israel in exile. This is the lament of people who know that Deuteronomy 27 and 8 and 9 have come true. The cry of people longing for Deuteronomy 30, for the real return, the real renewal, the real rescue and restoration, and the building of the new temple. And that, of course, is what Romans 8 is all about. Romans 8 encapsulates almost every aspect of Paul's gospel, so that we have the sending of the Son and the Spirit, as in Galatians 4, to do what the law could not do, to rescue God's people from their slavery, from their sin, from their death. And then as a result, the Spirit is given to indwell God's people. And that language of indwelling is again temple language, so that God's people themselves being led by the Spirit to their inheritance, like Israel being led by the pillar of cloud and fire towards the promised land. This people is the sign of new creation, just as the tabernacle and the temple themselves were pointers to God's desire to flood the whole creation with his glory. So in Romans 8, the church is the sign that God is eventually going to do for the whole creation what he did for Jesus at Easter. That is the hope that Paul sets out. So then we find the same narrative, only now from a very different angle, in Romans chapters 9 and 10. Because after Romans 8, Paul is faced with the question, well, what then about the ancient people of Israel, the Jews, Paul's own family, his kinsfolk according to the flesh? And the only way Paul can address that is to tell the story again, beginning with Abraham in Romans chapter 9, verse 7, and Abraham having 2 sons, and then Isaac having twins. And somehow the story is going in 2 forms all the way along, so that we then get through Moses, we get through the Exodus, and towards the end of Romans 9, Paul is tracking with the prophets who lament the fact that Israel has been narrowed down to a remnant, one small little group holding on to the promises, and even that remnant seems to be cut back and pruned yet again. And so then Paul says in Romans chapter 10, verses 1 to 4, "My heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they may be saved." But how is that going to come about? Paul knows very well that the story of Abraham in Genesis finally leads to the story of the covenant in Deuteronomy. That's how the law works. That's how the Pentateuch, the law of Moses, actually functions. And so the climax of the Pentateuch is in Deuteronomy 30, when Moses says that then, when you've been in exile, God will do the new thing. He will circumcise your heart. He will rescue you, so that then the Torah becomes quite a new thing for you, and it'll be a means of life. So what does Paul do with that? Paul says, "I can testify on their behalf," this is his fellow Jews, "that they have a zeal for God, but it is not based on knowledge. They are ignorant of God's covenant faithfulness. They don't know what God is doing in their own history. And so they're trying to establish a covenant status of their own. So they didn't submit to God's faithfulness. The Messiah, you see, is the goal of the law, the fulfillment. The Greek word is telos, the goal of the law, so that covenant membership may be available for all who believe. And how does he explain that? Precisely with Deuteronomy 30. Moses writes that the person who performs the law's commands shall live in them. But Deuteronomy 30 explains what it will look like in covenant renewal to perform the law. It says, don't say in your heart who will go up to heaven. Paul says, that will be to bring the Messiah down. Don't say who shall go into the depths. Paul says, that will be to bring the Messiah up from the dead. You don't need to do that. It's happened. The word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart, because if you profess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Paul has told the story from Genesis to Deuteronomy and has discovered that the climax of Torah is the Messiah, crucified, raised from the dead, and now giving the Spirit. Oh, there are other problems which come on beyond. But this is how Paul lives within the great story of Israel, sees it fulfilled in Jesus and the Spirit, and invites his hearers to make the same true for themselves.